It's very hard to see the greatness in other people and all around us if we don't first recognize ourselves.
Your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. This is the Building Psychological Strength podcast, where we explore ways to build resilience, build confidence, and make our minds work in our favor. We draw from the fields of psychology and life design to help us intentionally create a rock-solid mindset upon which a vibrant life experience can be built. My name is April Seifert. I'm a psychologist, a life design strategist, and co-founder of Peak Mind, the Center for Psychological Strength. Each week, I'll introduce you to an expert, a concept, a technique, or a hands-on practice that will help you build psychological strength in your own life. These are the tools to help you thrive. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Building Psychological Strength podcast. My name is April Seifert and I am your host. And this week we are speaking to the wonderful Sarah McVanel. She is an expert in the power of recognition. And this is really interesting because she does a lot of her work within the business and entrepreneurial space. So businesses and really big brands hire her to come in to speak to their leaders and to speak to their teams about the power of recognition in order to create amazing, top performing work environments. So what does that have to do with building psychological strength and the work that we do on this podcast, right? It's incredible because we had this conversation about the power of recognition and how it hits on some of the biggest areas of psychological research. Things like Martin Seligman's work on the PERMA factors. These are the factors that lead to well-being, psychological well-being, that drive well-being so much more than just positive emotions and feeling good. Recognition relates to all of them. It also relates to our ability to cultivate a growth mindset and to see failure as an asset that's something that we can learn from and find meaning from. There's so much meat in this conversation. I can't wait for you to hear it. It's always such a value to get to talk to an expert who has expertise in an area that I might only know on the surface. And so I'm thrilled to bring you Sarah's work. Sara has an incredible background. She has a bachelor's in psychology. She also has a master's in family relations, and she has spent 20 years of her life practicing organizational development within human resources departments. She's also a coach, a speaker, and has spent time in healthcare administration. I mean, you name it. She's been in a number of leadership roles, and throughout, she's seen how the power of recognition can help people thrive. I also should say she is extremely open and vulnerable about a personal experience that happened with one of her children that highlights how recognition helped turn things around within her own family. So you're talking about that blend of person who has not only expertise that you can get by going to school for a long time, but also the personal experience that you have when you've actually had to walk the walk and put that expertise to use in your own life. This is such a powerful interview, and I'm so excited for you all to hear this incredible content because there are action steps that we can take on a daily basis to cultivate this power of recognition within our own lives, to start to leverage the power of gratitude, of the PERMA factors, and of growth mindset. So this is a jam-packed interview, and you're not going to want to miss a minute of it because she is so beautifully able to succinctly and clearly talk about such important concepts. Before we dive into the interview, I want to make sure that I let you know that this interview is sponsored by our free live upcoming webinar, Limitless, where we will be diving into how your personal identity can influence the development of your self-limiting beliefs. Our goal is to show you how they form so that you can be aware and walk away feeling much more knowledgeable about where some of those beliefs come from and why they are so influential on our lives. We can't wait to share this content with you for absolutely free. There's a number of different live, all of them are live, a number of different live options. If you head over to peakmindpsychology.com/webinar. You can see all of the options, get yourself signed up. We really hope you take advantage of this amazing free content that we want to put out there just to make sure that people can learn a bit more about their minds and how they work. All right, let's dive into this incredible interview with Sarah McVanel. Sara, I'm absolutely thrilled that we are getting to talk to you today for this episode of the podcast because you have experience in there's a few areas in life where when we start to talk about it, people clam up. And I love talking to people who have a deep background and experience in those areas because we all need help in those. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, April. It's a pleasure.
So I want to dive right in. I want to get right at the heart of the matter of a lot of the work you do. And you do quite a bit of work around the notion of recognition, recognizing ourselves, recognizing others, the importance of it, how to do it, all of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do in that domain and help us understand the concept of recognition for the important concept that it is?
Well, thank you. Yeah, really, recognition was never something that I thought I would do for a living in terms of my whole area of expertise. And yet it's one of those lessons, you know, how the universe kind of keeps telling you what you need to pay attention to. I can remember my very first jobs. I think I started working at 12 and noticing how if only people valued the people that work for them more, they would get so much more discretionary effort. I mean, here's a 12-year-old analyzing, the workforce. And then, fast forward and I'm in school and I noticed that the professors who could see the greatness in their students and acknowledge it would have students work so much harder and would push past their limits versus the ones who had these super high expectations and were hypercritical. And then moving into my corporate career and moving into the field of organizational development, every time we go in and we work with a team that was imploding at the seams, the ones where we focused on recognition to help rebuild collaboration and healthy culture and respect, they would thrive compared to other teams where we try more challenging interventions like build trust or satisfaction with leadership or overall engagement. And so I guess it's one of those things that over my schooling and then over my certainly my career, noticed that recognition was the easiest variable in which to impact in your work and in your life that gave you always better results. And it's completely validated in the literature. I mean, Carl Rogers, you and I both would have studied him in school. One of the founders of humanistic psychology. And he said, if there's one thing people need more than anything else is to feel valued, heard, and appreciated. And in an era where many of us don't feel seen, where we talk a lot, we share a lot, we're perhaps even oversharers now, a lot of us still don't feel seen and heard. And that exists in workplaces and families, on social media and so forth. And so really that's what I have planted my flag in the sand and said, that's it. If we do not spend more time recognizing and valuing each other at home, in schools, in our workplaces, we will not see peak performance.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. Oh man, this is going to be really fun. This is going to be a really good time. What I'm curious about is why don't we do that? Why aren't we as forthcoming with, and I'm gonna keep saying like both with other people and with ourselves. Like why don't we find it as easy as it should be, or why don't we do it as often as we should?
Such a great question. And I was just on the phone with a CEO of a very successful company in the US. And he was asking me some very specific questions about recognition related to his team. And I think it epitomizes where some of the mental roadblocks we have on recognition. And, some of the questions were, how do I do it in a way that's sincere? How do I do it in a way that's fair and people don't think I'm playing favorites? How do I do it in a way that's consistent and it doesn't fall off their radar? So for one thing, why don't we do it is we get our up in our own sort of way, and we tell ourselves that there's a lot of reasons why it's not going to work before we even really try it. And then if we try it, we're so worried about what other people are going to think, as opposed to in that moment, what's most important. And when recognition works well and truly leads to peak performance is, I see you. Nobody else in this moment, even if it is a 15-second, thank you so much for what you did. Nobody else is more important in that 15 seconds than the person standing right in front of you. So that is seriously as basic and as easy as it starts. And in the research that we have in my book, my first book, Forever Recognize Others' Greatness, it's actually the number one way people say they want to be appreciated is with a verbal thank you. It takes so little time and energy. There's no barriers to entrance. So everybody in organizations and in families and in communities can do that. And yet we're often reluctant because of these roadblocks. So, I mean, that would be one thing I'd say, is that we tell ourselves there's a lot of things that are not going to work well before we actually know if that's the truth. Once we get past that and we start to have some successes, we may be a little bit hesitant to do it often or with certain people because we see certain contexts or individuals are off guard. So I can't recognize the CEO because who am I to recognize the CEO? Or I can't recognize that person who's negative because then they're going to think their behavior is okay. And yet, really, at the heart of truly authentic, meaningful recognition is, I'm going to acknowledge what I see is working right now. And it doesn't matter what perhaps you've done in the past or what your title is or how long I've been here versus how long you've been here. I'm just acknowledging your humanity in this moment and that things are better, whatever that thing is, because of what you did or because you showed up or because of your contributions, because of who you are. So those are some of the things that I see as fundamental for us to be able to truly leverage recognition when it comes to with others. But your question around why don't we do it more with ourselves is also so important, because really, if it's very hard to see the greatness in other people and all around us if we don't first recognize ourselves. And yet a lot of us have our humble pants pulled up a little bit too high. And I really apologize for that metaphor if I've just locked it into your mind. But but really it's we think that we are being more virtuous if we are being really humble. And I'm not criticizing people who are naturally humble people. It's just, it can be false representation of who we are in the world if we don't acknowledge that, you know what, I am actually pretty good at that, or I have worked very hard at that, or my value is to be truly family centered. And you're right, I work very hard to be a good mom, and I am pretty good. Yeah, I mean, I may not be perfect, but I am pretty good. So being able to see our own greatness and then be able to accept a compliment when somebody notices our greatness, because it is so obvious. People, warning, April, people can see your greatness. They can see it all the time. So at some point, you got to be ready for somebody to compliment you, because that is how obvious your greatness is. Really, it's a matter of being willing to let it in, both when we notice things about ourselves and not let that inner voice of, oh, that's not very humble, or, oh, it could be done better, or other people can are more efficient, or other people are thinner, or whatever that comparitis thing that we can have going on as our mental script running. What truly is, what's the truth in this moment? How is this good enough? And how is this better, perhaps even than it was before? So being able to recognize your own greatness allows you, in fact, to be less selfish, because then you're that much better able to notice and then acknowledge the greatness all around you.
I love that. You know what's so interesting? This is why I love talking to
Hmm.
people like you who have expertise in a very specific area, because I always leave understanding that area with greater nuance and to greater depth. And here's one example of what I'm talking about. I never would have made these two connections. So you're talking about recognition and the power of it and how, it can drive peak performance even over something like building trust and over some of these things that we hear in kind of organizational, leadership development programs, maybe that we've been a part of in jobs. I never would have made the connection to two very foundational psychological principles. The first one is so simple, but the concept of gratitude. If there's one
Hmm.
thing that improves people's well being more than anything else, it's expressing gratitude. And that goes, it's a multi-directional thing. So when we express gratitude to other people, not only does that person feel better on the receiving end, but we feel better having done it. And it's so
Hmm.
pervasive and it gets talked about so much right now, even in like Instagram land and other places like that, because the research is so strong. So I never would have made the connection to gratitude. The other thing that I never would have made a connection to is, and I'm curious about, I'm really way over my skis on this one. I am hypothesizing. I don't know, but I'm curious about your thoughts. When I think about some of the work that Martin Seligman has done, and so for folks who haven't read him, he's kind of the OG of positive psychology. He's written a ton about these factors that have the acronym PERMA. They are the factors that lead to psychological well-being and what he accounts as the good life. They are positive emotion, so that's the P, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. I think recognition hits every one of those. It
Yeah,
makes you
yeah.
feel good. It gets you engaged, in the situation. It's within a relationship with another people. It points to the work that you're doing having meaning or being meaningful, and it leads to feelings of achievement. Like I've done something. I don't know this again, and I never would have thought about it. I've thought about it for all of 30 seconds now, but I'm curious about your thoughts and what you've seen in the work that you've done with people in this area.
Oh, and I love how you connected it to the flourishing angle because that's really when we have cultures, and I don't mean cultures has to be organizational culture. It can be volunteer cultures, it could be your family culture. When we are focused on people being at their best and flourishing, as positive psychology talks about now, it's that we want everybody to do better. I do better if you do better. And because I want you to do better, you naturally are invested in me doing better. And so it's this psychological theory of reciprocity that we've learned so much about as well is and it's better on multiple levels. That PERMA is on it's both the person giving the positive feedback and recognition, it's the person receiving it. And here's the money angle, everybody. And I don't mean like financial money angle, although we have found that organizations do better financially when they have cultures of recognition and gratitude. But it's also the power of the vicarious benefit as well. So you
Mm.
create positive emotion, you create meaning, people feel a sense of achievement and belonging and greater sense of relationship when they're seeing this in their environment too. One of the reasons why I am so passionate about recognition, because I'm interested in a lot of different things, but when I say I'm so passionate is that when I made the leap from corporate to work for myself is actually was precipitated by my one of my kids having a very, very serious mental health crisis at 10. And he was not in an environment with PERMA. He was being severely bullied. Nobody was doing anything about it. He was very hesitant to tell us about it
Mm.
because he was at the age where it wasn't, quote, cool to have your parents intervene. But it got so bad that he was depressed and actually on medication for it. He was anxious. He developed tics and was talking about wishing he was never born. And then he comes home one day and I discover he started cutting. And
Oh,
I'm the person who goes to work every day and I do mediations and I help build healthy teams and I'm a coach. Like I talk about an identity crisis. Talk about somebody who felt like I am walking around like a total sham because I haven't even noticed what's going on in my own house. he was in an environment maybe at home where we could feel good about him and recognize him. But then he had this juxtaposition everywhere else, with the exception we learned of only a few kids, friends' houses, where he absolutely, there was no positive emotion. He didn't feel a sense of connection and meaning. He didn't have healthy relationships. There was no sense of achievement. There was very little engagement. He was disengaging with his life as a psychological barrier. And and we just started to double down on recognition at home. I mean, that was really the only thing we had total control over.
Mm-hmm.
And so every little thing we started to notice. We call it noticing the extraordinary in the ordinary. So I'd say to my husband, again, the vicarious experience, the kids would hear me say, honey, thank you so much for picking the kids up after school. Granted, he had been doing it for years and I probably never thanked him, but we have to be super intentional about it now. We're trying to heal our family, in particular our son. And, say to my daughter, thank you, Simone, for bringing the dishes over from the dishwasher. And Justin, thank you, Bud, for remembering you had homework, and little tiny, tiny things that honestly we had missed because life is busy and you don't always dial into your life. And you do feel this sense of obligation to keep up with and continually climb the ladder and deserve the money, the paycheck you make, and you want to sometimes spend time with your friends, and oh gosh, I haven't been to a yoga class lately. And we can get so caught up in our life that we forget that actually, if we don't recognize and be present in the moment to the greatness that's all around us, we miss these opportunities. And take it from me, you don't want to be in that situation where you have one of those negative aha moments where you realize, had I been recognizing the most important people in my life before this crisis hit, then probably they would have had the psychological strength to weather it a bit more, or maybe they would have told me about it earlier so that things didn't get so bad. So it became, honestly, April, it became the savior for my family. And I often share a version of that story when I deliver keynotes. And I would say equal to people to asking me questions about recognition and how do I implement it and things like that is actually people sharing stories about bullying at work, of their kids, mental health challenges, because so many people are going through that and we don't have the answers. We don't know what to do about it.
Oh, thank you so much for being open with, a very personal experience that your family went through. I have kids that are younger than that, but I've often thought about, my daughter is now almost 4, and, she's at the very beginnings of that where, one kid might pick a different friend to play in a game and she might not get chosen. And she's starting to get sad about that. And I can just see the trajectory of where this is going to go and get so much more difficult and meaningful to her when those things happen, that I just can't imagine how painful that would have been as a parent. That's really difficult.
It is. And at the same time, and that's one of the reasons why I can be so open about this, is I have permission from all the members of my family to share it. And my son's really well now. I mean, he'll say, and this is, I think, a perfect example of what you talk about psychological strength, that this is an example, is he'll say, I think this was the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because now I will not put up with ever being bullied. I won't put up with seeing other people being bullied. I can see the signs that somebody is hurting and I will ask them about it, because I won't let somebody else go through it alone. And honestly, at 16 years old, a hormonal is, a normal the way any grade 11 student would be, but he has super healthy psychological relationships. He makes really good choices about the friends he keeps. He has a super healthy relationship with his girlfriend. He and I are very open with each other. They choose to be home more often than they choose to be out with their friends. He's a really dedicated competitive rower. That takes some discipline to get up at 4:30 in the morning, when you'd rather be sleeping as a teenager. So he's been able to rewrite the story, as have I and my husband and my daughter, that it actually was just, we all go through tough stuff. And his just unfortunately happened really early in his life. However, all of us experiencing the recovery from that, the positive rebound from that. Not that life is perfect in our house by any means. It's just there is no household that does not have their own version of a crisis or challenge. I mean, when the kids were tiny, my husband was losing his parents. We went through that. Everybody goes through their stuff. Recognition, I'm hoping every listener hears me when I say this. Recognition is one of your easiest tools in your toolkit to get through the tough stuff, whether it be your own personal tough stuff journey, healing from a trauma, trying to deal with rejection or whatever that thing is, right through to difficult stuff that's happening around you. And you wish that you could protect your kids. You wish you could help your spouse who's going through that difficult merger and acquisition and who's not sure if he or she is going to have their job on the other end of it, or you've got a natural disaster your community's trying to recover from. It's an economic downturn, whatever those things are that seem like they're outside of our control. One of the things we always have control over is how much we lean into recognizing what is working in the moment for ourselves and what is working in that gratitude piece you talked about, being grateful and seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary even in tough times.
That was powerful. And actually now I mean, maybe I'm just confirmation biasing myself, which could be the case, but I feel like there could be something to this connection with the PERMA factors, because again, you're using this as a tool. You're right. There are only in adverse situations, the number of things that we feel like we have control over, it really reduces. There's things that the reason why adversity feels adverse is that it's heavy and it feels uncontrollable, and maybe it comes out of nowhere. These things we can't like wrap our hands around it, but recognition we can. And going back to some of Seligman's work in that book, Flourish, I'll link to it in the show notes just in case anybody wants to check it out. I'm talking about it more than I expected that I would, but he talks about this notion of thriving through adversity. So Positive Psych gets this reputation of being all about, let's put our rose-colored glasses on and pretend that, mom doesn't have cancer and that nothing bad is happening, and just pretend like we're happy all the time. And that isn't what it is. It's positive emotion is, one small piece of the equation that we've already talked about. Those other factors, especially things like meaning and engagement and relationships, those are much more important and they need to be there. And when they are, and when adversity happens, we can actually get through it and do what your son did. That's amazing. Come out the other side having, this approach to life that he's thriving and he's helping other people do the same. And it wouldn't have been guaranteed to go in that direction. So it's a testament to what you did with your family and the power of, really following some of the key foundational principles that, you and I have both learned and you're applying in this way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
If you're like most people, your mind isn't always your biggest cheerleader. Do any of these thoughts sound familiar? People like you can't do things like that. Come on, who do you think you are? Do you really think you'll be able to keep it up, even if you do succeed at first? Our minds send us a constant stream of thoughts throughout the day, and not all of them are helpful or even true. In reality, a good chunk of those thoughts are mental habits or assumptions that formed long ago, and they don't do us any favors, especially when we're trying to go after something big. These thoughts are self-limiting beliefs, and unfortunately, they're way too common. If you've ever experienced self-limiting beliefs, we've got the free webinar for you. In mid-December, Peak Mind will be hosting an absolutely free live webinar focused on helping you understand where those self-limiting beliefs come from and why they're so influential over you. We'll dig deep into the science of identity, and we'll help you spot those beliefs and see them for what they are, a set of unhelpful assumptions that you don't have to follow. Head over to peakmindpsychology.com/webinar to register. Imagine what your life would feel like if you didn't have those thoughts and beliefs holding you back. How big of a goal would you set? How much more confident would you be? What do you think you could accomplish? Join us live and absolutely free. Registration is required, so head over to peakmindpsychology.com/webinar to sign up. Your limitless future starts now. We can't wait to see you there. I want to turn the page just a little bit because there's another aspect where this starts to get a little hairy, and this gets into some of your more recent work. You know, we've all, many of us, I'm going to say all because, wow, probably all of us have been in a situation where we feel like we haven't met our expectations. We haven't achieved a goal that we wanted to set. Dare I say we have failed. How does recognition play a role in a situation where failure is involved? Because it feels like it becomes even more complex in those situations.
And it's so fascinating that you asked that question because you're right. I did release a book recently called Flipside of Failing, and I absolutely had no intention of ever writing a book on failure, especially having decided that what I wanted to do when I grew up was to be a recognition expert. So recognition and failure seems to have absolutely no connection. And yet, when I went out to interview all kinds of really amazing people, so I'm Canadian, and so I went out and I interviewed other Canadians, Everest climbers, Olympians, 3M scholars, people who have achieved the seemingly impossible, as well as people who had been through huge adversities, like they were in residential school systems and removed from their family. They had addiction issues. They were incarcerated for a period of time. And yet they turned things around to live into this amazing version of what they're destined to do. That concept in PERMA around meaning, they found meaning on the other side of some traumas and some really negative experiences. The only theme that arose in every single one of those grounded interviews was how important failure was. Now, of course, just because you find something doesn't necessarily mean it fits with your mental model, and you can ignore it because, it's your research. So you're allowed to do whatever you want to do. So I completely ignored that, and I still tried to write the book on greatness. And I'll tell you, I failed twice because it would be the world's most boring book on the planet. So here I am, recognition expert, totally failed twice. And I'm like, okay, universe, fine. I guess apparently I'm supposed to write the book on failure. So as I reread all of those interviews, and particularly the parts where, again, unsolicited, people talked about how essential failure was in a success or in overcoming the adversity that was in their life, whether they self-imposed it or it was sort of put in their path, what I learned was they unconditionally recognized themselves and had context, environments around them where they could be recognized and not judged for things that didn't always work out. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this is the deeper story around failure. This is the story around how if we can recognize ourselves and others, even when there is a challenge and adversity, then that's even more meaningful. That is even more, like, for example, the failure of me turning off my phone to silent, and yet it's still ringing. Thank you, Apple, for that technology that's clearly a tad flawed. Anyway, but the point is, when we can recognize ourselves and others unconditionally, that feels way more authentic and meaningful than sometimes what people think recognition about, which is, good job, you met that milestone, or wow, you published your book. That's awesome, April. And sure, those are great things. It's just they're very outcome based. They're very achievement oriented. And if we wait till something is fully successful before we're willing to acknowledge ourselves or others, we are missing so many opportunities between now and then to perform at our peak. And frankly, we may fall short of our peak if it is so conditional. The Paralympians and Olympians that I interviewed for this book, they never really thought that they would medal. Now they did medal, but they didn't set out to perform and get the podium spot. And therefore, when they didn't get the podium spot the first time they went out, they weren't disappointed. In fact, they just trained harder and they developed amazing relationships with their fellow teammates, and their coaches were just so in admiration of what incredible teammates they were and how they cheer for the people who did medal or for the people who came close. And then the next Olympics, that was when they medaled. When you don't set out and you have this super conditional idea about what would be highly valuable enough to be recognized, then we can actually we can see ourselves and others in a much more authentic, real, humanistic, and humanizing way, as opposed to the conditions that we often attach to recognition.
That's huge. There's so much wrapped up in that. There's, the concept of our value as a person not being tied to any financial or box checking accomplishment, right? Mm-hmm. Michael Phelps is not a more valuable human being than anyone else. He just swam faster on a number of occasions, much faster, and kudos to him for all the work. But he's not a more valuable human being than anyone else because of those medals. And I think that's important. The other piece that I think is important is it's not possible. I did an entire episode on this. It is not possible to achieve a really big goal that is a true actual stretch of your ability without stumbling and failing along the way. And if you need proof of that, Google Elon Musk and some of the YouTube videos around him developing the SpaceX program. It's funny to sit here and watch Elon Musk blow up rockets over and over, but literally think about the emotion he must have been feeling as he put millions of dollars into something that he just blew up into the ocean. I can't even imagine. Yet, we get up to give a speech, or we go to propose something at work, or we, try something within a close relationship that doesn't go as well as we think it does, and we let it cripple us. Yes. I always think about Elon Musk. I'm like, did I just blow up a multi-million-dollar thing? No, I didn't. This isn't that big of a deal. And even that is not that big of a deal, because look at him. He's fine. And he's like flying spaceships to the, outer space now. So good for him. But I just think that hits on so many pieces around we need to reframe the way that we see failure and not look at it as an end point that somehow makes us not valuable.
And that we can admire somebody for what they achieve in this area of their life, and things are not always rosy on the other side. I mean, Elon Musk, his drive for innovation and as just the epitome of the modern day entrepreneur, he's had a number of failed relationships, and I'm sure he's probably with a supermodel as we speak in this particular moment as we're recording this podcast. So, I'm sure he's not without a friend or two in his life. But if that were really, really important to him, maybe he feels like a failure because people that he really, really loved and he married one day, it didn't work out. And yet maybe it doesn't. I mean, that doesn't define you as a person as well. Similarly, somebody who has had the most loving, long-lasting relationship, but they've had 8 failed businesses in their life. They're not a failure because of those businesses. It's like, why don't we take a look at what is most important to somebody and acknowledge what's working in their life? This is the solution-focused approach that I come from in the world is, well, what's working? There's always something that's working. And we can, if we hyper-focus in one dimension of our life, and we only believe that one dimension is the most important area of peak performance, what happens when things go wrong? When we look at our, given that we're on the athlete sort of theme, and often that's who we talk about when we talk about peak performance, look at some of the folks who are just the top of their field in their sport of choice, and then they retire. What happens in their life?
Yeah.
Often you see addictions and you see failed relationships and you see depression. I mean, sometimes it can happen because of their injuries they've experienced, and that's not always the case. I'm not trying to, make a blanket statement there. But it's also though with with CEOs or people who define themselves through their careers. Then they retire and they get depressed and they gain weight and they feel unhappy in their relationships. It's we need to, for us to be able to live wholeheartedly and holistically and truly live that PERMA framework that you so aptly pointed out. I'm so grateful to you. You're the first person who made that connection for me. So thank you for that. That well-being intermingles with our relationship with failure. And that we cannot define one aspect of our life as the most important dimension to define success. And that if we in fact see that there are multiple dimensions that are important to me as a human being, and I'm always in the pursuit of trying to be trying to have my own version of peak performance, which could be different from my mother and my colleague and my spouse. And I'm trying to really figure out for myself, what does peak performance look like at this phase of my life, in this aspect of my life or my career. That is, I think, how we can start to really recognize our own success and be honest with ourselves when we aren't really living into our potential. Because it's the yin and the yang. It's peak performance is also being honest with ourselves when we really have let something slide that's important to us or important to people that we really, really care about, and that there's some work to do. I had some major work to do when my kid got sick, because there were definitely things that I was missing. Beating myself up about it at the time did not help. I can definitely tell to folks, if you're looking for what not to do not wallow in how you could have done things differently. The past is the past. You need to focus on the current and the future. So looking at that and going, okay, I looked at my phone too much. I can't sleep with the phone beside my bed. I've got to get home for dinner more often. I need to find better ways of asking how he's doing, because saying everything okay clearly is not the right way to get answers. This is how we look at our life and our work, and we figure out, okay, what maybe worked before isn't quite working in this situation. I refuse to define myself as a failure, but this is not working. What do I need to try? What's one thing I could try that's different? Almost always recognition can be our fallback plan. And then there's a whole host of things that I'm sure you can suggest to listeners in our conversation that come to mind for you around stepping into your peak performance when something's not working. I mean, what are some additional suggestions you have, April?
Yeah. You know what? One thing that's coming up that I actually just made a note to make sure that we chatted about this. There's another really big body of work by Carol Dweck around growth mindset. And this feels like growth mindset's a tough one, right? It's hard for people because we are very focused on sort of grades and outcomes. Did I do it well or not? Am I good at it or not? And growth mindset is this notion that we can develop capabilities over time, that our, personalities, that our skill sets, that, very much less about us than we think is a fixed set of capabilities, that we can actually develop capabilities over time. And having a mindset of that means being open to continuing to try and do the hard work of developing those capabilities. Now, I am again over my skis, but I'm guessing that having a culture of recognition around you, both recognizing yourself, others recognizing you, and you doing the same in kind to them, puts you in a position where growth mindset would be a bit easier to cultivate if you felt like you weren't such a definitive black and white failure because you didn't get there. And here's the key word, yet. You're not there yet. Yeah. It's such a huge word within Dweck's work. And I think you could really embody that word a lot more if you could recognize yourself along the way, not just wait until the end. And if you succeed, great. Now I deserve recognition. If I don't, okay, great. I'm an abysmal human being. Like, that's awful, right? Yeah. That's awful. So that is what came to mind immediately as you were describing this. I'm like, oh my gosh, I bet you could live into Dweck's work so much better if you cultivated that culture around you.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a relevant point because when I really dug into those interviews with people, these peak performers, which ironically I put on a pedestal, and then as soon as I started to look at their life and their work through the lens of failure, all of a sudden they felt like peers. And that's the irony, right? Is that when we notice and we see people at not perhaps at their best or not optimally, and Dr. Dweck actually talks about near that very concept at the beginning of her book, that she did not have a growth mindset because she thought of things in kind of black and white terms, and it was work for her and the evidence was there, and she did the work, and that's where she can really epitomize this and can be a model of how you can evolve to having a growth mindset when she did not necessarily have that sort of perspective. And so absolutely we can move to that. And one of the key things that I think might be helpful for our listeners is this concept related to growth mindset, which is a failure resilient mindset. So what does that look like? That looks like I accept failure, not because it's pessimistic, just simply because it's realistic. And and failure can look like tiny little disappointments, and it could look like things that feel like colossal, identity changing, life changing. Um, my career is upside down, and everything in between. So when we accept that failure is going to happen, and there's an acronym there, and I'm happy to give you a link to put in the show notes. Then we don't have to resist it. There's powerful questions, and all of these questions came from learning about what works, what kind of questions these peak performers ask themselves to make failure their superpower as opposed to their kryptonite. And and it's that the growth mindset and having a failure resilient mindset at foundation of both of them is being really curious. Like and here comes back to the meaning concept in PERMA. If I have to believe for a moment, even if I don't know what it is, there has to be some meaning in here. There's no way I could lose my mom this early in my life. It's not fair. There's no way my husband could leave me. There's no way that I would lose my job when I was just last week, I got the best performance review ever. When things like that happen, we don't have to feel good about it. And we can still ask, is there some kind of meaning behind this? And this is really a concept we talk about in the speaking world, the professional speaking world, is your mess is your message. Nobody wants to listen to a speaker talk about how great they are and how they have all the answers for an hour. We have to talk about what's not working, how we stumbled, or how this particular person was able to transform something. That's way more interesting. The hero's journey. There has to be something that doesn't work, how the hero bumped up against something and it didn't go according to plan, or they had to transform or whatever. It's actually a way more human and interesting, frankly, world experience, because you're right. Every single one of us, and this, as you say, the beginning of this part of our conversation, this is where the challenging part is. We have to admit that we all will experience challenges and failures. Like, you're raising a beautiful 4-year-old daughter. At some point, she is going to not like you, and it's going to be really hard. And that doesn't make you not a great mom, and it doesn't make her not a great kid. That's going to be part of her growing up and one day being able to launch as a brilliant woman in the world. There has to be this push-pull dimension that happens in relationships sometimes. I had terrible postpartum depression after both of my children, and I think it prepared me to have a kid who was depressed, because I am so much empathy for him, because I know what it feels like to not be able to sleep and to just wonder, why the heck am I even on this earth? And I'm so empathetic with my clients, because if they are dealing with something really difficult in their life, I can empathize, because I remember so painfully and deeply what that was like to feel like a failure in the most important thing going on in your life, and for it not to work out. So these things are, it sounds trite to say there are teachers, but really if we choose to lean into meaning, that actually is what they are.
I love that. it's powerful, but it's also so supported by, so many lines of research within
Yeah.
the field of psychology. I'm wondering, as we're wrapping up, if you could give an action step to folks who are listening to this. How do they incorporate more recognition into their own lives? Because it's such a powerful thing. We've hit on so many outcomes that it can drive. I want people to be able to put this to use.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can take this suggestion inwards or outwards. So I guess that's the choice that you have. Choose your own adventure as to how you wish to use this exercise. But compliment every single day until it becomes a habit. So
Nice.
you could compliment yourself, you could journal it, you could write it on a post-it note, you call up your mom and tell her how awesome you are, and she'll absolutely believe you. So, that's a definitely good choice to do that. And she'll say, I know that already, I'm sure. Or you could compliment somebody else or both, like make it a combination. And the research on habits is actually showing that it often takes more than 21 days to form a habit. And so just keep doing it until it just is so automatic you don't even have to think about it anymore. And you can practice this habit by vicariously experiencing it. If you witness somebody give somebody else a compliment, there you go. There's your habit formation for the day because you were still part of that complimenting school of practice. So that would be my suggestion. Compliments are often underutilized, and it gives us more comfortable receiving them and giving them the more we make it an intention.
I love that. That's so good. Before I let you go, I have to ask you for your definition of psychological strength. How do you think about it?
I believe psychological strength is being able to see greatness in yourself or in your environment, even when there's no immediate evidence that it exists.
That was beautiful. Ah, I'm like cheering over here. That was
Yeah,
so
right?
good. That was
Great. I should
so
write that
good.
down.
You
Does that
should. You should. Luckily, we were recording this. So,
I love
oh my
those.
gosh. When people want to find more about you, like find your books, find all of that, how can people connect with you?
Mm-hmm. You can go to my website, greatnessmagnified.com, and I am pretty much everywhere on social. So Sarah McVanel, McVanel, would love to connect with fellow psychological strength warriors like you, April, and all the people that listen to your podcast.
This has been so wonderful. Thank you so much. As I mentioned, I love talking to people who have expertise in a particular area. I'm walking away feeling really just feeling driven to make this
Mhm.
more of a central part of my relationships and the work relationships that I have, personal relationships. It's just so important. So I want to thank you for the work that you're doing and for sharing it with us today.
Oh, you're so welcome. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
It's a simple fact that nearly everyone in the world could benefit from building psychological strength. But not everyone will put in the time and effort to do so. But today you did. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Building Psychological Strength. Now, if you're interested in building the mental toughness, confidence, and resilience you need to thrive through life's ups and downs, visit us at www.peakmindpsychology.com. Also, if there's someone in your life who could benefit from this episode, please share it with them. And if you yourself found this episode valuable, meaning if you took away even one insight that you can use to build psychological strength in your own life, we would so appreciate it if you would drop us a rating and a review on iTunes. The thing is, the more ratings and reviews we have, the easier it is to get this powerful and important content out to the people who need to hear it. Remember, your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. So choose wisely, my friend. And I'll see you next time on Building Psychological Strength.